So I kind of put together a few things in this talk. And so I'm going to kind of touch on a few things a little deeply, and then some I'll just kind of give you a little taste. And then if you have questions or follow-up, I can definitely refer you to the paper, or we can discuss further. And feel free, of course, to interrupt me as we're going along with any questions. And as usual in the Zoom world, I'll try to keep an eye on things like the chat and everything else. So this talk today will be kind of a conglomeration of a couple of works, one of which is by the joint work with the top three folks here. So Dr. Han Liu, who's now at University of Wisconsin, former postdoc of mine, Laura Balzano at Michigan, and my current PhD student, Chris Tomer. Other work will also include work by Longzhu Wang, who's a postdoc here at UCLA, and Keenan Ham from Texas Arlington, as well as another postdoc of ours, Hong Kong. In addition to those folks, I have, this includes collaboration with many student groups, including some REU groups. So you can probably tell by the photos which ones were before 2020 and which ones were post 2020. But lots of good groups contributed to, especially the experiments and the applications, which will be about 50% of the talk today. So kind of the theme of the talk is to kind of show the way we can use different types of matrix and tensor factorizations to do various applications. And so I'll talk a little bit about some theory for one of the variations, proving a convergence result, and I'll also kind of give a high-level overview of what these factorizations look like. And then I have a bunch of pictures that show the applications that we've been interested in. So the first factorization that our group does a lot with is non-negative matrix factorization. And there's also a tensor variant for this, but in the matrix case, it's a little bit easier to get an idea of. So the setting is as follows. So if I have a data matrix, let's assume it's non-negative for the time being. Imagine that my rows correspond to, say, users, and the columns correspond to, say, variables. Then the goal of NMF, non-negative matrix factorization, is to factor into two low-rank components. One will be the same number of rows, so the same number of users, by what we'll call topics, and I'll mention what that is in a second. And the second factor will be topics by variables. So what's the idea here? In NMF, as the name suggests, we're going to actually ask that those low-rank factors are also non-negative. And so what this does is it asks that each column of the data matrix needs to be represented as a non-negative linear combination of the dictionary atoms, the second factor. And so because of this, the dictionary atoms must be sort of the positive parts of those data columns. And so kind of a quintessential example, this is due to Lian Song, is the following. If the data consists of, say, faces, so the images, the columns are images of, say, human faces, then if I do something more traditional like PCA, I learn components that are accurate in reconstructing the faces. But because I'm not restricting to non-negative dictionary atoms, I get things that just look like this here. If you can see my cursor on the lower left, I know it's a small image, but it looks like this here, and it doesn't really mean much to the human eye. Whereas if I require the dictionary atoms, the factors, to be non-negative, then I get things like here in the upper left, which again, I know it's very small, but these actually correspond to things like noses, mouths, eyes, and things like this. And so it's actually interpretable, right? There's actually some meaning behind these features versus just using these kind of eigenfaces that maybe don't have as much meaning to the human. And so even though these eigenfaces and other factorizations can be used to reconstruct the face, they kind of lack that really interpretability. So as I said, this was popularized by this paper in Nature of 1999. So going back to this problem and this setup, of course, there's lots of different applications. But what we're going to do now is kind of look at another way of interpreting what these features represent. So remembering that they're non-negative, so both of these factors contain non-negative entries, then I can look for large values, right? And the large values are going to tell me something. So for example, if there is a large value where this red square is in this first factor, And this is going to tell me that this user corresponding to this row has a large association with whatever this column's topic is. Okay, well, what is a topic in this setting? What we're then going to do is go to the second factor over here and look in this corresponding topic row in this case, and look for large entries there. If there's a large entry in this row, then I'll say that this variable corresponding to this column is largely associated with this topic. And so the idea is it's a little bit subjective. We can go kind of back and forth between these two factors to really suss out what these features are really representing. So I think a concrete example might be useful here. So imagine that our matrix consists of users and their movie ratings. So rows are users, columns are different movies, and the values are their ratings. Then it could be that these topics might be interpreted as, say, a genre of these movies. And so if I go to this user here who has a large value with this particular topic, this particular genre, I can then go into the second factor and find that corresponding topic and look for the large entries. And so say the large entries are these three movies that I've listed here: Titanic, Love Actually, Sleepless in Seattle. If you know anything about these films, these are maybe romantic films. And so I would then say, okay, this genre must correspond to romantic films, and this user then must really like romantic films. And so then I can use that to do things like prediction and all sorts of things. And so the beauty of this here is, although it's a bit subjective, looking kind of between these two factors really not only lets you reconstruct the matrix and do things like completion and prediction, but you also understand why that's happening, right? Because of the interpretability of these factors. Okay, so that's kind of the high level picture. We can now formulate this mathematically, and for the moment I won't write any regularizers down, but I will say that, of course, one can add different regularizers for different purposes. So the goal of an MF is to, again, factorize this data matrix, which I'll now call D by N, into a pair of low rank non-negative matrices, which I'll call W and H. So W will be D by R will be the number of topics. That's a user chosen parameter. And H will be R by N. And so we're going to solve this optimization problem here, where we're just searching over all non-negative factors, W and H, of the right size. And we're looking for the pair that minimizes the reconstruction error, right? We're minimizing the Frobenius norm, let's say, of the data matrix X minus the product of the factors. And so we can view this as sort of a decomposition into a dictionary and a coding factorization. So we'll call W the dictionary matrix. We can interpret those columns as dictionary atoms. And then the coding is the encoding of those dictionary atoms to explain the data. So dictionary W, coding H. Okay, so that's kind of maybe the static, I'll call the static NMF problem, where we have a fixed data matrix and we're looking for those two fixed factors to explain the data, and then we're finished. But I'll now mention an online version, which we've been looking at a lot recently, and we've actually found some really cool and exciting applications for this. And so as the name suggests, the online version considers data that is streaming in over time, or data that's just changing in some way over time. And then the goal will be to learn a factorization that is best, usually an expectation. And I'll showcase later in the applications that we can actually use this for prediction and time series data. So, in March 2020, we were using this to predict COVID data, and we have some other applications as well. I'll explain maybe in more detail when we get to the applications, but the idea there will be that, so kind of this diagram showcases what's happening here. So these top XI values are the data matrices that are changing across time. So X1 is the data at time step 1, X2 is the data at time step 2, and so on. And what we're doing here is we're learning these pairs W and H at each time step. But as the diagram suggests, we're using the history of the previous learned factors to update the next ones. And so I'll showcase kind of the static versus the online version of this diagram in a moment. And what we're going to be doing for prediction is use windows across time to update these factors. And then we're going to predict sort of when we slide the window into the future and we get a factorization. That's going to be our prediction. So I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Again, this is just a quick one slide to remind us that all of this does extend to the tensor case as well. It's just harder to draw and more tedious to notate, of course. It's a little bit non-trivial. There are a couple of things one has to work out with a linear algebra in the tensor setting, but there are non-negative tensor factorizations and online versions as well. So everything that I'm saying here does actually extend to the tensor case, and we have a separate paper on that, but I will kind of stick to the matrix case just for ease of understanding. Okay, so going back to kind of this diagram and comparing the two just to make sure that we see the difference. In the static case, so I have a fixed data matrix. Remember that our goal was to minimize the Frobenius error of the reconstruction, so x minus WH. And so you can use something like block coordinate descent, and that's kind of where this diagram comes in handy again, right? We're going to fix W, solve for H, and fix H and solve for W and so on. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at with this diagram. So here's our input data matrix X, which is not changing over time, but now we're looking at kind of iterations. So I'll solve for W0, fix that, and then solve for H0. Use that as the input, right? Solve for W1, and so on and so forth. And the hope, of course, is that this will converge, and I'll say a few things about that. So you can actually extend this idea. So this is a block coordinate descent approach. Will give rise to the multiplicative update rule, which is by far the most widely used. And this also dates back to that same paper that I referenced before. And it turns out that using this approach gives a very simple update rule. So you can actually write down the updates entry-wise for both H and W, and then you just iterate this. And so looking at this, you see it's very straightforward to implement, which is why I have all these REU students, right, even undergraduates working on these problems, because it's quite easy to jump into. And in terms of conversions, it's known that this Frobenius error here is non-increasing using this update scheme, but there is no guarantee to convergence to any station. Okay, so switching, kind of going into the online version, there'll be a couple of assumptions that one can make. We're going to be interested in a situation where the data is drawn randomly according to some distribution pi. So we're going to assume a stochastic process for X. And then the question is, can we still learn the best dictionaries that describe that data in expectation? And so here's our diagram again, and we're now considering the convergence of these factors, right? And so this is really kind of the question that we're getting at. And again, different assumptions we can place on X. We're actually going to be interested in the case where X is an irreducible Markov chain, and I'll explain kind of why that comes up. And the goal will be to construct a sequence of factors, W and H, such that almost surely we get this convergence. So what is it saying? We want, again, this reconstruction error at time t. So we have the t data matrix minus its factorization that we've learned at time sub t. We would like that error to converge to the best possible error over all factors, W and H, of the error in expectation. Okay. So it makes pretty intuitive sense. We want the Frobenius error at time sub t to converge to the best possible error in expectation. Okay. So this group of folks here, Marl et al., gave a solution to this problem, and they actually prove almost sure convergence of the empirical law. So there's a couple of kind of surrogates that we have to look at, and they proved it for i.i.d. data matrices. So they assumed that the xt were independent and identically distributed. And this was the idea. So this is their algorithm, and we'll be using the same. So upon arrival of the tth data point, we solve for H by just simply minimizing that Frobenius error again. And here, as I mentioned, we've added an L1 regularizer to H. I'll just pause here and comment briefly why this makes sense, right? So when you think L1, you probably think we're trying to promote sparsity in some way, and indeed that's true, right? So if we're talking about interpretability of these factors, then like going back to the movie example, I don't want a bunch of movies to have large values in one of my features. I would rather just a few of them have large values. So this is mainly used for the interpretability. If we have too many things with large values, it's kind of hard to understand what exactly that feature represents. So we're going to solve this first optimization problem for H. And then given that, we'll then solve for W by not minimizing the true error, but we're going to introduce this upper bounding surrogate for the empirical loss. So this is the empirical loss at time step t. And the surrogate, I don't need to get into too much of the details, but if you're interested, it's simply just sort of what you would expect. It's the average over the previous losses. So why is this important? The takeaway from this formulation is that we're recycling the previously found coding matrices H1 through HT, and then we're using them as approximations to the subproblems. And so the good news is that this limits, it reduces the number of optimization instances that you have to solve. So one thing you might still be wondering is, okay, so it's great that we're recycling these previously found factors, but do we really need to store all of them? Not only does it look like we have to store all of the previous factors, it looks like we also have to store all of the previous data matrices. And so the good news is that that's not actually true. So you can actually write down an equivalent formulation to the previous algorithm by actually doing something like this. So this first line here is the same. So we're still solving this optimization problem, but now we have introduced these annoying looking, but actually quite innocent matrices AT and BT. These are just aggregate matrices, and they are kind of storing the information of the history. So they're storing the information about H and X, and then it turns out that that's all you really need. And then you can solve another optimization problem for W. And these matrices are actually a reasonable size as well. So this is just kind of a clever linear algebra trick. And it's good that you don't actually need to then store all of the history. And I will say that this is sort of where, when you're going to the tensor case, these aggregate tensors become a little bit annoying to deal with. But you can actually show that such aggregate tensors also exist. And so you have the exact same reduction in the tensor set. Okay, so here is the same algorithm as I've just shown. Again, you can, if you want more details about what this is actually doing, I'm happy to show. But pretty easy to implement, solving kind of some fairly simple optimization problems. And you can actually prove convergence as well. So this group, again, as I mentioned before, proved the following. So under the assumption that the data is i.i.d, having some common distribution pi, if we look at WT and HT as the solutions to this, this approach here, then we can say the following about the convergence. So the good news is, I didn't go into too much detail, but we have, remember, the surrogate for the empirical loss. Well, the good news is that both of these functions converge to the same constant almost surely. This sort of just suggests that using this convex surrogate is totally reasonable. In addition, we get that the gradient of the actual loss converges to 0 almost surely. And what we're going to want to do then is kind of ask if we can get these same sort of convergence guarantees, but we want to relax the i.i.d assumption. So that was the goal. So when we were first looking at this result, it's a great result. This is the algorithm that's widely used. It performs very well in practice. Now we have convergence results for the i.i.d case, but the applications that we were interested in were applications for which the data was very far from i.i.d. For example, COVID data. You know, we would hope that from week to week, you know, COVID case numbers, for example, are not independent. But it seems more reasonable to believe that they might be Markovian. Same is true for many other data distributions. And in addition, even if we're talking about, say, sampling a network or sampling an image space, If you're allowed to do it in a Markovian sense, then you can kind of take a local random walk, which is much more computationally efficient rather than having to sample over the entire network independently. So there was various reasons that we wanted to generalize this assumption. And so what we did was we did not change the algorithm whatsoever. So it's the exact same algorithm, but we just changed the assumption on the data. So we now look to an irreducible Markov chain with unique stationary distribution pi, and then ask about the convergence of W and H from the above as well. And the good news is we get pretty much the exact same convergence guarantees. So the empirical loss and its surrogate again converge to the same thing in expectation. We get that their difference converges to 0 almost surely, and we also get to the gradient again vanishes. So same convergence guarantees, but now we've allowed ourselves to go into the Markovian setting. Okay, I guess I can pause if there's any questions. That I wanted to just kind of very briefly mention some recent work of ours for CUR decompositions. And I'll showcase a couple of applications here as well. I feel like these are in a similar flavor to non-negative factorizations in that because of their structure, because CUR will come from the matrix itself or the tensor itself, it still allows you for some interpretability, right? The idea here would be if you understand what the data atoms itself represent, then looking at a CUR decomposition should also be interpretable, since you're actually going to be choosing the atoms for the decomposition as well. So just a quick reminder of what CUR looks like in the matrix case. If I have a square matrix A, let's say D by D, and I'm going to form three factors C, which will consist of columns of A. So I'll pick K columns of A, and R, which will be a row submatrix of A. So I'll pick S rows of A. And then I form U, which is the intersection. So kind of the purple overlapping here in this picture. And the kind of big theorem for CUR decomposition in the matrix case, right, is that if the rank of U and A are the same, then you can use CU and R to write down a decomposition. So A is the same as C times U pseudo inverse times R. And so what we wanted to do was, a lot of our work and many folks are looking into tensors now. And so we wanted to ask, is there something similar that we can do in the tensor world? So here's just a little bit of motivation, and then I'll show kind of two formulations we derived for the tensor setting, which is a little bit heavy notation and technical writing, but then I'll show two pictures, which I hopefully will make things a little bit clearer. So here's our motivation. So let A again be square. So we're still in the matrix case. And here's CUR decomposition. Then if we're kind of looking forward to the tensor setting, well, you can write the CUR decomposition or the matrix case as if it was a two-mode tensor, right? And so we're just going to expand CUR here by inserting the identity matrix and then realizing that we can actually write this as a mode-wise multiplication, viewing it as a two-mode tensor. And so this is kind of one hint as to several ways you can actually define such decompositions for the tensor case as well. So as I said, it's a little bit technical, and I'm just kind of throwing the main theorem up here, and I can refer you to the paper for details, but I will show a picture that I hope will make it a little bit clearer. But this is going to be the first tensor CUR decomposition we propose, which we're calling a dory CUR. And again, I'll mention why that name comes up when we look at the photo or when we look at the diagram. But let's let A be a tensor with dimension D in each mode, and let it have multilinear rank R in each mode as well. Then just like in the matrix case, when we're selecting rows and columns, we're going to select some set of indices in the ith mode, we'll call it I sub I, and now set the tensor R to be the tensor A restricted to those indices. So this is kind of analogous to choosing the rows in the matrix case. And then for this formulation, we're going to set a matrix C sub I for the ith mode to be the ith unfolding of A, restricted to this kind of cross product of indices. So these indices for C are functions of the ones that we chose for R. And then the UI will be kind of similar to matrix case, the restriction of those CI matrices. And then you can actually prove the following. So the rank of UI is the same as the mode rank of A, so it's R. And you can write down a CUR tensor decomposition for A by taking this R tensor and mode-wise multiplying it with these products. So CI times the pseudo-inverse of UI. The rank of this tensor R is the same as the rank of A, and you can actually even show that the rank of the unfolding is also R. And if all of these hold, then you can actually also write this as a mode-wise product of all of these CI matrices. So before getting to, again, the diagram, which I hope will make this a little bit clearer, I'll just mention the second one, and I'll just highlight the changes really. So this we call a fiber CUR, and it's very similar to the previous, except that here I'm free to select both these i.i. indices for the rows, and as well as the ji indices for the columns. So these I'm now free. So if you recall in the dory case, the second set of indices was a function of the first. And then we get similar guarantees here as well. So we get a CUR decomposition for the tensor case. So if all of that was just too much to understand, we'll just look at this picture here for a second. So this top case here, we're going to look at the dory CUR decomposition for a 3-mode tensor. And here we've chosen the I choices, so the row indices, if you will, to be the intervals kind of corresponding to this yellow interval here, the blue interval, and this red interval here. And then the JIs in this case are chosen for us. And so here, the matrix C1 would be if you just took this red subtensor that's shown here and you unfolded it along mode 1. C2 would be found by taking this green, I guess it's green, subtensor here and unfolding it along mode 2. And then C3 would be taking the yellow and unfolding it along mode 3. And then this kind of dotted subtensor in here shows that R subtensor. So I think visually it's sort of clear how these components are all put together. Then you can use them to multiply to get the original tensor. And we named this Chidori because my postdoc, Longzhu, was giving a talk and Dustin Nixon was in the audience and he said, oh, this looks like this game called Chidori. So that's where that name comes from. In the fiber CUR decomposition case, here we again have more freedom. So JI and II may not necessarily be related. And so here, the lines are corresponding to the rows of C2, and the red indices within each of these fibers corresponds to the rows of U2. And then here, the subtensor is R again, and here you see that there's not necessarily this intersection property because you had a bit more freedom. So I think useful factorizations here. And we showcase in a few minutes that we can also, just like in the matrix case, these tensor CUR decompositions are not only useful theoretically, but you can actually use them to do some applications like foreground and background separation and things like this. Okay, so for the remaining 20-ish minutes, I was just going to kind of run through some applications, and if no one asks questions, I'll probably go through them fairly quickly. But if you want me to elaborate. I have
a question on the chat. Sorry, what does unfolding the tensor mean?
Oh, unfolding. You literally have, so if it's a 3-mode tensor, you literally just kind of stack these slices together in a concatenation, and then you get a matrix. So I guess the visual is you are unfolding each slice. If that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah. So it's a matricization of the tensor in a certain manner. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So I have many applications here, and I'll probably go through some of them in more detail than others. But I think these really are interesting, and I think they showcase how these factorizations can be used in different ways. So I hope that that's interesting to the audience as well. So the first application I work a lot with is called MyLime Data. And this is a patient-driven large survey, a national survey for patients with Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is a vector-borne disease, typically transmitted by insect bite or blood-to-blood contact. And the symptoms, especially of the chronic variety, mimic those of other illnesses like multiple sclerosis, ALS, Parkinson's, fibromyalgia. The CDC estimates 300,000 new diagnoses each year, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this is a very, very large underestimate. Climate change is only making this worse, and so there's lots of predictions. In fact, recently I read an article that the next pandemic will be brought on by vector-borne disease. This particular disease is poorly understood, it's poorly funded, poorly diagnosed, and poorly treated. And so the folks that run the nonprofit LymeDisease.org said this is a prime candidate for data-driven study. And so they launched this large survey about 5 years ago. And I've been working with them since then. And so the survey has many, many questions, but one group of questions is just questions about the symptoms. And there's lots of discussion in the Lyme community about different manifestations of the disease. There are co-infections that run with the disease. So it's not just the Lyme spirochete, but also other co-infections like the Babesia and Bartonella and these other co-infections. And so the manifestation of the disease in different people varies quite highly. And so learning how to diagnose those and treat those different manifestations is something that's been really discussed a lot recently in the literature. And so here, what I'm showing, and I'll just probably focus on this rightmost plot here, I'm showing a list of symptom questions, and the patients rated their severity of each of these symptoms. And I'm just showing the result of a non-negative matrix factorization on this batch of data using 5 topics. And I've just sorted these questions so it's a little bit easier to visualize. So these kind of dark orange values are large values. And so just like in the game that we were playing at the very beginning, we can then look at each of these dictionary atoms and look for the large values and suggest that this kind of describes what that topic is. So for example, the first topic that we detected is associated with nerve pain, psychiatric issues, muscle aches, and heart-related symptoms. The second one corresponds to this patch, and so on and so forth. And so there was a couple of interesting things here. So we presented this to the board, which consists of physicians who treat Lyme disease in their practice. And they highlighted a couple of things that they found interesting. One of which was this third topic here, this middle topic. This middle topic corresponds to memory loss, twitching, sleep impairment, and cognitive impairment. And these are all neurologic symptoms. And so there's been this question that has come up in some clinical studies recently that has detected a neurologic manifestation of Lyme disease. And so for some reason, whether it's due to co-infections or just how the body and the immune system reacts to the disease, it manifests in a very neurologic focused manner. And so this suggests that perhaps these patients are exhibiting a neurologic manifestation of the disease. And so this is very important, not only for diagnosis, but also for treatment. So these patients probably should be treated in a manner that's different than, say, patients who manifest in a more physiological way. So this was one interesting thing that they highlighted. The second one that they highlighted was this question here, which is corresponding to a bullseye rash. So if you have heard of Lyme disease, you've probably heard of something about a bullseye rash. So for many decades, it was believed that if you were bit by a tick, the only way that you would have Lyme disease is if you came in with a bullseye rash. So it's a rash that looks like a target shaped. And so physicians, if you didn't exhibit that bullseye rash, wouldn't give you antibiotics. They would say that you were fine. And now in recent years, it's believed that actually more like 25 to 30% of people present with a bullseye rash. So it's much less common. And so there's a large number of people who are coming in and not being diagnosed correctly just because they don't exhibit the bullseye rash. So when they looked at this diagram, the fact that this bullseye rash is one of the few questions that doesn't really show up anywhere suggests that actually maybe this isn't such a big factor in the manifestations or in the diagnosis. This was something that kind of suggested that could be accurate. Moving on to another application. This is for images. So as you can imagine, there's lots of things one can do in imaging using these factorizations. Here we just showcase that even the online version is relevant for imaging applications. And so what we did was we just took a Markovian random walk through the image and sampled batches of pixels, and then apply to an MF, learn the features at the end, and then showcase these features here as these small patches on the right-hand side, and then use these patches to reconstruct the image, and we get good reconstruction down below. So it's kind of maybe a graphical approach to image compression, if you will. You can do other things in imaging like co-segmentation or saliency detection. So here we have some images. So we have images of cows, dogs, cars, and bicycles, and we're doing classification. So this middle row is a semi-supervised non-negative matrix factorization, which adds a classification error term and allows you to classify images as coming from one of these 4 classes. And the good news is not only can you do classification, but again, the reason that I think non-negative matrix factorization is interesting is that you can also get interpretability. So not only do I know that this image is a cow, but I can ask the algorithm, why is it a cow? And so what we've done here is we've highlighted the pixels within the image that have those large values corresponding to the topic that is suggesting it is a cow. So this is essentially doing saliency at the same time as classification. So in other words, say in this image here, the red pixels that we've highlighted here are the pixels that are corresponding to the classification answer of a cow. And they correspond to, unsurprisingly, the cows, which is good news, right? That seems like what it should be, but you never know, right? In a black box algorithm, it could be that it's classifying it because there's grass in the background or something like this. So it's good to know why the algorithm is doing what it's doing. In the dog case, it tends to be the face of the dog that's most important. In cars, we tend to see things like tires and headlights being the most important feature. And in bicycles, we see things like the wheels being the most important feature. So I think it's really nice to be able to get good accuracy in tasks like classification, but also be able to go back and see why the algorithm put things where they did. So here I'm going into the prediction world. And so I mentioned before how we wanted to use online NMF to do prediction. And so I'll just kind of re-say how we're actually doing this. So if you recall, in the online setting, we have data that's streaming in over time. So we have data that's changing. Here, this is an example of COVID data. So we're actually getting different data at different time steps. And what we're doing is we're putting a window over, in this case, it was 6 days. So every 6 days, we put a window and we're learning a factorization and sliding that window into the future and doing the iterations. And so that's the online NMF. At each of those windows, we can also do reconstruction to see how accurate our factorization was. With data we actually have, we expect the accuracy to be very large, to be very good, since we've actually done the factorization given that data, and we know that the algorithm converges. However, if I slide the window beyond where I actually have data, there's nothing preventing me from using the current factorization to do reconstruction into the future. And when I slide that window just beyond where I have data, that becomes a prediction. And so this is the method that I'm showcasing here. And so what we're looking at is, so this was kind of early on. I think this was summer of 2020. So we have 6 different countries, and we're looking at confirmed cases, deaths, and recovered cases. And what I'm showing you here are the different dictionary atoms for these cases. And so maybe it's a lot to look at, but I'll just kind of highlight just some things that you notice. For example, the China curve tends to be different in all of these. And again, that was because this was early in 2020 when the cases in China were different than these other countries. And so what we do with these is we take these atoms and we again slide the window beyond current time, and we do a reconstruction there, and we use that as a prediction. And so that would be our predicted values. And so what I'm showing you here are the 6 different countries again, and we're doing prediction. So the blue dotted line is the actual data, and the red line that you see here are the predicted values. And so you see for most of these cases, we do really well. Where there's no blue, we're predicting way into the future where we start to see a lot of erratic behavior happening. But if we're doing local prediction, we're looking a week or 2 weeks into the future, we actually do quite well. And so you can see the results. And these 5 do really well. The interesting one is when we don't do very well, and that's China. And so here, you can see that there's a lot of error in our predictions, say at this kind of peak right here. And the reason that this is happening is you can see that there was kind of this strange decrease and this huge spike in cases. And our algorithm, because it's using very local information, believes, okay, whenever you see a small decrease, you're going to see a big spike, which is not accurate, right? There's probably something unusual happening with reporting or something like this. And so our method starts to predict these spikes and then eventually realizes, okay, that's not happening. And then it kind of goes back. And so what I really like about this is it's, I think, one of the few algorithms that can really use a local, it does really well at local prediction, right, in very small time steps. And so what I would like to do into the future is to incorporate both this local model as well as a more global model. So for COVID cases, maybe we use an SIR model as well and kind of merge the two together to avoid these kind of cases when we make bad predictions because of strange local information. So I think going forward, that'd be something that we're interested in. This is another application we just started working on recently, and this is using online NMF for studying EEG data. So here, this example is using the UC Irvine EEG alcoholism data set. So this consists of 64 electrodes over a certain time period. And they're just looking at the raw data of those electrodes, which we of course know is very noisy, but we can still do actually quite a bit. So here, these different colors correspond to the different 64 electrodes, and these are the features that we're learning from 1.5. So these are the dictionary atoms that we learn. Not a whole lot to see here, except that maybe they're pretty. But the interesting thing is what we can do with those. So if we take an EEG data, right, it's very important to see how different nodes are correlated. That's kind of something that people want to learn, right? And so here, what I'm showing on the left is just taking the raw EEG time series data and doing a Pearson correlation. And so we see, for example, the line corresponding to here says that this column and this row are highly correlated. And so you can see these different patterns, and those patterns were interesting to the neurologists. And so what we did was we took, instead of the raw data, we just took the dictionary atoms that we learned and then applied a Pearson correlation to those. And here is the result that we get from applying just looking at a Pearson correlation of the UNMF dictionary atoms. And so you see that we pick up kind of these big, strong correlations, and the rest we've kind of dialed down. So the question that we have is, are we doing some sort of denoising here, or are we really missing information? And so we took this a step further. And so not only is it interesting to look at the correlation themselves, but it's also interesting to look at the correlation of the gradients, right? When our nodes increasing together or decreasing together. And so here on the left, what I'm showing is the Pearson correlation with the gradient as well. And so you pick up kind of more interesting patterns and relationships. And here I've done the exact same thing. We've learned ONMF atoms on the data, which is the raw data and the gradient. And you see that these are very similar. So it seems that we're capturing enough of the information just in the dictionary atoms. But I find what's very interesting is this third graph, which is applying ONMF without any gradient information, just the raw EEG data, but we're allowing for more topics. So we've allowed for, in this case, 16 topics. So we've allowed for more higher rank in our factors. And then when we take the Pearson correlation of just those dictionary atoms, we get something that looks strikingly similar to what we get with using the gradient. And so I think what this suggests to me is that these dictionary atoms actually are carrying a lot more information than maybe we let on at the beginning. The fact that it can kind of capture similar relationships to what the gradient is capturing without it ever actually seeing the gradient, I think is pretty exciting. So that's something that we're kind of working on a little bit more now. I'll try to wrap up. Here's just another example with imaging. So we've looked at an fMRI here. This is the fMRI of a mouse brain. And these kind of yellow and pink are strong activation regions of the brain when the mouse is being stimulated with certain stimuli across the 2-second interval. And so what people want to look at in this experiment is, which areas of the brain are activated during which experimental stimulus. And using ONMF makes this actually quite easy. So here are spatial atoms here, and here are temporal atoms. And so what one can do is say, okay, for example, this atom here that has these 2 regions of the brain highly active, you can then look into the second factor and see what point in time is that corresponding to. So I think it's actually corresponding to this atom here. And so you can say, okay, at 0.8 seconds, this area of the brain is very active, rather than having to look through frame by frame and kind of manually sussing that out. So lots of interesting applications with video and so on. I'll just end with quick, since I promised I would show a CUR method as well. So here we've used various CUR decomposition approaches for compression. And so this is compression and reconstruction. And the good news is these methods tend to work very fast. And there's lots, that we can do here. I of course don't have time to go into detail, but here is the last one that I mentioned, which is separation of foreground and background. So you've probably seen things like robust PCA used for this process. And here we have a version of robust CUR. And it turns out we can do just as good as robust PCA in terms of separating the foreground and background, but this method is much quicker. And it has interpretability, which has sort of been the theme. So I think I will end there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.